Racism emerges really in the 16th and 17th, particularly the 17th century. Europeans were enslaving and had for some centuries been enslaving people both of Africa and of the New World.
The history of racism in the Western world is broadly associated with slavery as the early form of colonialism. And it's in that context that something called race is created, which essentially means that certain people who are defined as non-Europeans find themselves ruled and governed by Europeans.
For people in America in the 17th and the 18th century, race was a fact of life. And I think that racism is something that comes out of that interaction of necessity. This isn't people cooking up racism in their laboratory or in their study and then going out into the world to apply it. In a sense, white people, and blacks and Indians, worked out their ideas of race in proximity with each other on the hoof.
The British don't become slave traders and slavers because they are racist. They become racist because they use slaves for great profit in the Americas and devise a set of attitudes towards black people that justifies what they've done. The real engine behind the slave system is economics. Africans are items of trade. They're things that are bought, that are sold, that are bequeathed, that are inherited. They're like other items of trade. And once you've got that established, both on the slave ships, of which there are thousands leaving British ports, and once you've got that established on the plantations, and once you've got that established as a basis for expanding British wealth, how can you argue that somehow or other the great inferiority of black people isn't built into fundamental cultural values of the British?
John Hawkins was perhaps the first English trader to actually kidnap slaves from Tagrin, which is a couple of miles from Freetown, and forcibly took slaves away from Sierra Leone. The sad thing is that this man was even made a knight. When we were in school, we read about Sir John Hawkins as if he was such a good person, he was such a righteous person, somebody who had contributed positively to, the creation of the British Empire. It was only much later that some of us learned with regret that, in fact, he was not only involved in the slave trade, but he actually captured, slaves.
He established places down the quay, down by Government Wharf, what we call Government Wharf now.
Over time it became an industry, and a lot of English traders and a lot of Sierra Leonean rulers, particularly those along the coast, became heavily involved in the slave trade. And we have, for instance, several islands off the coast of Sierra Leone that were prominent slave trading posts, like Bonds Island, for instance, where there were English force, other European South force, even Americans were very heavily involved in the slave trade from Bonds Island.
We say that come for buy. The number there, in a group iron, the number we want, he take come. He put on this fire room, obi, a banner, na sudara.
And of course, we know the way they were taken, captured, tied up, chained, and thrown into the ships.
So it was a very bad experience for the slaves from the moment they were captured up to the time they reached the so-called New World.
And then those who survived and did arrive, had to be put for sale. And then when they were bought, they had to undergo all kinds of indignities.
One great woman, it could cost 2 man price. Sometimes it work for you, not the garden. Not come back, it work for you, it born picking for you. Now for that, it pay 2 times for one great woman. When the boat come collect tuna, go. No cardine.
At a conservative estimate, over 11 million Africans were transported across the Atlantic. Manacled and packed together like animals, at least 2 million died during the infernal voyage known as the Middle Passage.
Slaves are seen as deracinated people, people who did not belong, who were natally alienated. That is, they had no rights of birth, and they're seen as people who had been torn from another society but not socialized into the new one. So they were socially dead, so to speak. They were seen as people without honor, which is a degraded condition. The value of this for the master is that the master had absolute power over the slave, regardless of what the laws may say. They had rights of life and death.
A situation grows up where thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of these black or dark-skinned people are being kept down without rights and kept at work night and day by a system of surveillance with whips and cutlasses. And of course there is the fear that they will try and rise up, that they'll try to run away, and that when they do that they're going to slaughter the masters and the overseers and their wives in their beds. And really that any white person will be seen as a potential enemy by the blacks. And so you get this mutual fear between the two groups, and this tends to consolidate racial feeling. And the only way to keep these slave societies even minimally secure was to arm all the white men, and even indeed some of the white women too.
So you're there in your plantation manor, you're there in your settler outpost. What are the natives doing? Sort of classic line, from these movies. The natives are restless. What's going on? Those drums in the background. There's the idea that these people are sort of getting together and they're going to invade us, they're going to attack us. And it's a kind of projection basically. In other words, you've invaded their countries, you've subordinated them. There's a long history of colored perils. There's the red peril called Red Indians. There's the yellow peril, there's the black peril. There's this idea of the non-white other. And the non-white other is threatening, the non-white other is scary, the non-white other may be coming to attack. And it comes out of, you could say, a bad conscience in part, a sort of subconscious recognition perhaps of the kind of things that have been done to the non-white other.
In the early 16th century, from Chile in the south to Florida in the north, this non-white other was no more than vermin to be exterminated. The Dominican monk Bartolomé de las Casas was eyewitness to countless atrocities against the native populations. His account reads like a catalogue of genocide.
The mainland and the region known as Florida. The Spaniards murdered many, as is their custom, in order to strike terror into the hearts of these people. They made their lives an utter misery, treating them as so many beasts of burden. In another large town, the butchers put the whole town to the sword, young and old, chiefs and commoners, not even the children were spared. The butcher-in-chief arranged for a large number of natives in the area to have their noses, lips and chins sliced from their faces. They were then sent away in unspeakable agony and all running with blood, to act as walking testimony to the great deeds and holy miracles performed by these dauntless missionaries of the Holy Catholic faith.
The things that Las Casas witnessed, particularly on Hispaniola or in Cuba, these incredible crimes, these incredible attacks on Indians, disembowelings and burnings and rapes and whatever else, I'm sure that that level of violence is something that you could have witnessed in different places in the 17th, the 18th century, in other parts of the Spanish Empire. But it was a peculiarly awful moment that Las Casas saw as the Spanish got to the Americas and tried literally to work the Indians to death.
The reports of Las Casas caused enough unease for the Council of the Indies, the Spanish administrators of the New World, to call a debate at Valladolid in Spain in 1550. The debate concerned not just the mistreatment of Indians, but whether they could be categorized as human at all. In contest with Las Casas, the champion of the native populations, was the Jesuit Juan Ginés de Sepulveda.
By this time, the Spanish have been in the Americas for about 50 years. And during that time, the brutalities carried out by the conquistadors had reached such heights that it caused some alarm. And out of that context came this particular debate. On the one hand, there was this idea that the Indians had souls, they could be Christianized, and they should be treated not as servants, not as forced laborers, but as people under the protectorate of the Spanish. On the other side of the debate was the idea that perhaps these are not people with souls, perhaps these are people who are natural slaves. And in that context, they could be coerced to produce labor.
What Las Casas wanted to do was to change the policy of the Spanish crown towards the Indians. So, paradoxically, he was able to get slavery of Indians banned. That's something which the Spanish crown bans, outlaws, and by 1542 the laws have been changed to ensure that there can no longer be Indian slaves. But Las Casas also suggests that the labor shortfall in America can be made up with black slaves from Africa, which I think he later regretted, later in life.
It's a key moment insofar as the reflection on the system that produces race is there in that debate. The system that produces race, which will produce race over the next 200-300 years, is that colonial system, which takes this diverse range of peoples and defines them as Indian, forces that category on them. And it's in that context that you begin to see two things that go hand in hand with the development of racism. On the one hand, the institutions that keep in place exploited populations, oppressed populations, and in that context, the debates that then take place as to what kinds of populations they are. These debates begin with lawyers, they move to anthropologists, and then they move on to biologists, always debating within that context of colonialism, which fixes those people as objects of investigation.
Thursday, 11th October. Thus far and no land. Another 12 hours will decide.
A crucial moment in the racial history of the whole Atlantic world and of the world is Christopher Columbus, but not the first voyage, which everybody knows about, but the third voyage in 1498. Columbus sailed south to Sierra Leone, where, as he noticed, the people are very black, perfectly black. And then he sailed due west from Sierra Leone, and he wound up near Trinidad and the northern coast of South America. And he reported that the people there were white with blonde hair. And that shouldn't have happened according to the prevailing theories of skin color in the whole classical world in the medieval period. What happened with Columbus is that people started to realize that you could stay on the same latitude and get radically different skin colors. And if that was the case, then there had to be some other explanation for skin color other than geography. So that's where you begin to get the emergence of biological theories of difference in skin color. And that leads eventually to racist theories of differences in skin color.
And so a view emerges, originally identified as pre-Adamism, that maybe there are multiple origins, and that less civilized, more primitive human beings have an origin that is not accountable for by a biblical narrative, but are closer to the animal world. And that view then develops into a view called polygenism, that is multiple origins.
When Europeans first encountered chimpanzees, they were really struck by the similarities between what we now call chimpanzees and humans. But they called chimpanzees drills. And one of the questions that John Locke talks about in his essay concerning human understanding is the question of whether human beings have mated with drills. So the question that gets increasingly asked in the 17th century is, are African peoples what we would call the same species as Europeans? And Locke has real questions about whether we can say that they're the same species or not. And one of the explanations for African people that you start hearing in Barbados, for instance, the English colony on Barbados in the 17th century, is that black Africans are produced by the sexual union of a chimpanzee and a human being. So they're not really human, they're half animal. And this gets bound up with a whole series of prejudices about the animality of Africans, their bestiality, their sexuality is animalistic. Even in the 20th century, you get all sorts of claims about jazz music being animalistic. These are prejudices that begin to be ingrained in European culture in the 17th century in the context of what we think of as major scientific or philosophical texts.
And literary texts too. In The Tempest, whichever way you interpret Caliban, Shakespeare's weird hybrid reinforces the idea that slaves are not fully human.
Shakespeare doesn't quite know how to figure the hewer of wood and drawer of water. Is this the working class? Is this the proletariat? Is this the African? Is this the savage? Shakespeare doesn't know, and he creates Caliban.
Thou poisonous slave, got by the devil himself upon thy wicked dam, come forth!
In The Tempest, it seems to me pretty clear that Shakespeare imagined Caliban as a black slave. He has an African mother and a black devil father, and that in some ways Caliban is the first representation of the rebellious, sexually obsessed, violent, ignorant black slave.
I have used thee, filth as thou art, with human care, lodged thee in mine own cell, till thou didst seek to violate the honor of my child.
Would it have been done? Thou didst prevent me. I had peopled else this isle with Calibans.
Shakespeare presents him as somebody who will be tricked by a few baubles, not crystal meths, not crack cocaine, but by a few trinkets and some booze.
Many a Caliban might have found himself in the English plantations of America. In fact, The Tempest was partly inspired by the story of a ship which ran aground on Bermuda, where the crew then mutinied. The Sea Venture had been bound for the plantations of Virginia, a slaveholding colony in which Shakespeare himself had a financial investment.
The economic notion of the plantation as a large site of agribusiness and of a large cooperation of human labor for the arable field begins in Ireland, begins in Ulster. Of course, it was a London merchant house that wished to plant dairy and to start the plantation of Ulster at the very time that, at Shakespeare's time, towards the end of Shakespeare's life, that the Virginia Company is establishing a colony in Virginia.
The idea that the great glory days of England begin with Elizabeth, there is no successful English colony under the reign of Elizabeth. Great English imperial aggressive victories start happening in the 17th century, really under Cromwell, with the growth of the empire and the conquest of Jamaica. And that's when the English also began to perceive of themselves as part of a superior white race.
Oliver Cromwell is a fierce and powerful revolutionary figure. He was a great general and commander of capitalism that transformed the Atlantic, if not the whole world. This mighty vision he had of doing God's work had begun in the fens of England, where the huge hydraulic works of Van Muden in Holland are harnessed to drain the fields. So he played a role in that, and to discommon, or to remove people from their customary lands in order to produce the riches of the alluvial plains of Lincolnshire and the Norfolk Broads. He then transforms that interrelationship, shall we say, of water and land to crossing the Atlantic and to establishing the sugar plantations. He doesn't do this alone, of course. He does it with a class of people. This is why we say the capitalist class, because they hope to capitalize the land, turn the land into commodities and then into capital, and do this through the sugar plantation in the 1640s, in the very time of the English Revolution or the English Civil War. It's an amazing story of conquest, cruelty, and God.
So if you look at something like the southern states of America, up until the point of the American Civil War, the greatest amount of wealth in America was the ownership of slaves and slave labor. Now this is enormous. And it's in that process of being able to command the resources of other parts of the world, extract them for your industries and that labor, that you create this massive structural inequality.
The British become well off on the basis of the slave system. Liverpool, Bristol grow to kind of extraordinary levels of material and urban well-being because of the slave system. Lloyd's of London, the Bank of England, Barings Bank, Barclays Bank, Lord Harwood at Harwood House, stately homes left, right and centre, are absolutely rooted in this slave system. But it's a slave system that needs a justification. That is the kind of racist element in it. But the real rationale for it is profit.
The sort of laundering of slave profits, as opposed to simply the relocation of them in economic enterprises, is, I think, a very important part of the modern development of Britain. For example, I always think of Bristol, the development of Clifton and so on and so forth, absolutely tied to the slave profits from the 18th century, early 19th century slave trade.
Slavery as it existed in parts of Europe prior to this period of the Atlantic slave trade was not particularly color-coded. Yes, the slaves in Western Europe might be Slavs, but, you know, they have the same skin color, and you couldn't tell by looking at somebody whether he was a slave or not. But, you know, by the time you get to the West Indies in 1700 or something, you can tell by looking at somebody whether or not he or she is a slave.
The ancients, by and large, did not suffer from that form of race identification and slavery based on race, but they had their own version of it, which was that all foreigners, all non-Greeks, all outsiders, in principle, could be enslaved legitimately because they were inferior. It's not just people who are not Greek who are regarded as inferior in this sort of unalterable way, but Greek men regarded Greek women in somewhat the same way. So if you are male and Greek, you belong just by that very fact to superior categories.
To begin with, racial feeling can take simply the form of aversion, of dislike. But in the case of New World slavery, what it's doing is taking the form of domination, of exploitation, something much more coherent, something much more purposeful. It's not just a casual prejudice against people who are unlike ourselves. It's a determination to use those people who are unlike ourselves. So it's this that creates the more intense racial feeling that comes out of the widespread adoption of slavery in the plantations in the Americas.
In antiquity, defenders of the institution of slavery didn't rely on ideas of racial inferiority or skin colour to justify it, but the ideas of one of the great thinkers of antiquity, who was much quoted in the Valladolid debates, would be adapted to the context of New World slavery.
Aristotle, if I could use an awful phrase, is the nigger in the woodpile, because his views were looked back to from the later medieval period onwards and cited because Aristotle was regarded as, though unfortunately he wasn't a Christian, he lived too early, nevertheless he was the next best thing. And if he said slavery was a natural phenomenon, then it probably was. But it's very important to be clear that Aristotle was not speaking in terms of external racial characteristics, colour.
Genesis chapter 9, verse 25. And Noah began to be a husbandman, and he planted...
An authority even greater than Aristotle's was invoked to justify slavery: God and his good book. Genesis chapter 9, verse 25 was interpreted by Christians as divine authorization for trafficking in slaves and the ownership of plantations.
And this is kind of a funny story, and from our perspective it seems sort of ridiculous, but this was taken very seriously indeed. After the flood, Noah gets out, there are still waters all around, and so Noah decides he's going to set up a vineyard. Noah gets drunk. He has 3 sons, Japheth, Shem, and Ham. Ham goes into Noah's chamber while he's lying in this inebriated state, and then takes off the sheet, looks down at Noah, and then calls in his brothers.
And Ham, the father of Canaan, saw the nakedness of his father.
And says, "Look at our father who's lying naked," and tries to get his brothers to laugh. When Noah comes round from his stupor, he's furious, and he pronounces a curse on Ham's descendants.
And he said, "Cursed be Canaan, The servant of servants shall he be unto his brethren.
So he says that Ham's son, who's called Canaan, will from then on be cursed in perpetuity, and he'll be a slave to the other two brothers, Shem and Japheth.
The curse of Ham was not specifically black from the beginning. There was a medieval writer representing the lords of the manor saying the peasants are the descendants of Ham, and that's why they have to serve. The word slave originally originated from Slavic. And these were people who had been captured on the eastern frontiers of Europe. And it was not until about the 15th century when the Portuguese in West Africa began to specifically identify Africans with the curse.
But the idea is that one branch of the human family has been enslaved because of this curse, which Noah pronounced on Ham.
It's a kind of one-size-fits-all oppressors story, because you can decide whatever group it is that you want to enslave or oppress are the descendants of Ham, and therefore you have a biblical justification for your mistreatment of them.
Christianity it does different things at different times. In other words, there's certainly a strand of thinking in which people justify slavery by arguing that it's bringing people in Africa into Christianity and so forth.
Christianity is just one aspect of a number of different systems of thinking that would create the colonial basis for the kinds of knowledge which will be used to define non-European populations. So you move from Christianity to liberalism, to notions of humanitarianism, to capitalism. All these kinds of interventions are part of trying to manage and make sense of what the colonial enterprise is without questioning the colonial enterprise, without questioning what Atlantic slavery is.
Christianity's role in slavery is very complex. For most of its history, it basically accepted slavery as part of the order of things. In a way, the parallel would be the attitude towards a homeless person today. I mean, we see it not as a sin or as evil, but as an unfortunate situation. And this continued right up to the middle of the 18th century, when a truly radical change took place in which some Christian thinkers began to see slavery as a sin.
Enslavement of the natives of North America was never European policy, but that didn't make life any easier for these indigenous peoples, whose relationship with the settlers would ultimately leave most of them either victimized or dead.
If you look at Native Americans from their perspective, when white people arrived, they were a disruption, they were shocking, and they were surprising in all sorts of ways. But for many Indians, they simply looked at them as another rival group. And this is one of the interesting facts about 17th century American history. From Indians' perspectives, whites were in a way a bit similar to other rival Indian nations. So perhaps you'd trade with whites, perhaps you'd make war with whites, perhaps you'd ally with the whites against another Indian nation. Indians didn't see things in white and red, if you want to put it that way, white and red terms, because the white settlements weren't powerful enough until much later in the 17th century, even into the 18th century. So they didn't see this as an invasion, as a form of genocide, in a way that would unite them as Indians against white people.
The ways and thoughts of the white men are strange.
But for all that our skins are of different hues, we are friends, Chingachgook.
You could talk about the 18th century as a 100-year period in which Indians increasingly realize that the battle is between them and white people. And in 1763, when it became clear to a host of different Indian groups in the Midwest that the wind was changing, they launched a rebellion. It was led by an Ottawa Indian named Pontiac, laid siege to the British fort at Detroit. He didn't succeed in destroying the fort, but he got the people there very scared indeed. And it made London aware of the problem of managing Indians, especially in the Midwest. And one of the most extraordinary things that happened is that George III declared in the autumn of 1763 a line of proclamation. That's what it was called, the line of proclamation, which forbade any white settler from settling beyond the Appalachian Mountains without his explicit permission. So effectively, the idea was to put the brakes on white settlement to preserve British trading relationships with the Indians. But of course, the irony here is you've got tons of white settlers moving to America looking for land. So in effect, in 1763, this royal proclamation creates a new tension between ordinary white settlers on the ground and the Crown. And it's definitely one of the contributing factors in the American Revolution. White settlers believe after 1763 that the British government doesn't support them, and instead it backs the Indians. And after the American Revolution, or in the process of the American Revolution, the gloves really come off for white Americans, and the new United States is not an Indian-friendly nation in the least.
Native Americans were in an impossible situation. Side with the British, whose stronghold was Fort Detroit, and they risked the wrath of the rebel colonists based in Fort Pitt. Side with these Americans and their militiamen, and they would invite merciless retribution from the British. And as for trying to stay out of it, even if you were in Pennsylvania, a state founded by Quakers upon principles of Christian brotherly love, this too could have fatal consequences.
Now, one group that didn't pick one side or the other were the Moravian Christian Indians, who were gathered in 3 little communities, the most important of which was called Gnadenhutten. These Moravian Christians, there are maybe 100, 150, had tried to stay out of the war. They weren't hostile Indians. They had adopted many of the customs, the equipment, the technology of white people. They read the Bible. They sang hymns. They were, to all intents and purposes, the dream model of people back in the 17th century who wanted to convert and civilize Indians. And then a group of Pennsylvania militiamen arrived. When they had taken everything that they had that could be construed as a weapon, you know, tools, axes, whatever, that the Indians had, which could be used against them, the militiamen got together and decided to kill every one of them. So every single Indian, in fact the majority were women and children. I think there were around 30 men, so the rest, 60 or so, were women and children. All of them were massacred. They were brought in pairs to a hut where they were hit over the head with a cooper's mallet. And their brains were dashed out without any regard to their obviously being non-combatants. And at the end of the massacre, the white militiamen who'd committed it melted away. There was never any legal action taken against them. And their argument was that these Indians had tools with writing on them, or they had books, or they had implements they could only have stolen from white people. And that's the tragedy or the irony of all of this. In a way, the things that showed that those Christian Indians were civilized were used against them because these militiamen couldn't believe they belonged to them. But I think that's a tremendously evocative story for Pennsylvania, because what began as this noble experiment with white people and Indians living side by side had now turned into this most grisly kind of race war, in which the distinctions between good and bad Indian are totally erased. It goes back to one of the problems, I guess, for Americans, white settlers. What does it mean to be an American? What is there about America as a place which defines the people that live there? When the Boston Tea Party took place in December of 1773, this protest against the tea taxes which are being imposed by London, and you get these patriots running onto these ships of the British East India Company and pouring the tea into the harbour. They dressed as Indians. Now that to me is tremendously interesting, because they dressed as Indians to prove they were American. It's as if when you get past the stage of mastering Indians militarily, they become incredibly useful culturally in articulating Americanness, the idea of being American. And, you know, there's a reason why there are cars called, you know, the Cherokee, you know, or the Pontiac. I mean, you line up the major Indian leaders, line up the major Indian tribes, and you can probably find a vehicle or a weapon named after one. You know, the Apache helicopter, you know, Tomahawk missile. You don't have to look very far to find that kind of connection.
And many people have pointed out the Indian appears on the nickel, but the African appears on no coins. So the Indian was sort of a symbol of America in a way. Not the full destiny of America was to be civilized, and Indians were to become civilized or they were to die out. But they still identified with America in a way that Africans could not be. The one thing that comes to mind looking at it over a long period of time is that one of the main distinguishing features of black-white relations in the United States has been the idea of the so-called one-drop rule. Purity of blood. To be white, you could not have an unknown black ancestor. It wasn't always enforced, but this was the rule. Indian blood and intermarriage with Indians, going back to John Rolfe and Pocahontas, was not taboo. So that when Oklahoma became a state, it was interesting, in the Oklahoma Constitution, there were a number of part Indian figures who were involved in the setting up of the Oklahoma state government when it was in 1910. And the law said there could be no marriage between whites and blacks, and no marriage between Indians and blacks. But that left Indians and whites to freely intermarry.
The mid-18th century is considered a pivotal historical moment, when the Enlightenment dream of the brotherhood of man, championed by philosophers like David Hume, Voltaire, Rousseau, and the encyclopedists, came to prominence. This period gave rise to the ideals of liberty, equality and fraternity, principles that fueled the American and French revolutions. But these popular democratic principles were never universally applied. Choose any intellectual giant of the Enlightenment, and almost without exception, you will have chosen a proponent of equal rights, who really believes that some men are more equal than others.
Kant is seen as, one of the most important philosophers of the modern period of the past few hundred years. And he's certainly seen as the most important moral philosopher, in that the crucial idea is this idea of personhood, and you respect the personhood of others, you don't diss other people. And yet, simultaneous with that, Kant also has these writings in anthropology and physical geography, in which he basically outlines a kind of four-tiered level of human beings. It's basically a racially restrictive view of personhood, that a prerequisite for being a personhood is basically being white. It's only the European tier, the sort of top tier, who have what it takes to become full persons. And Asians, one rung below Europeans, blacks, one rung below that, Native Americans. These are the tiers. Even if they're human, they're not full persons.
The Enlightenment is a two-edged sword. It provided the basis for an argument for the social and political equality of all men. But at the same time, it provided the opportunity to look at human beings not as children of God, but as varieties of animal.
So if you decide that certain human beings are not human, they don't belong to the same species, then of course they don't have any right to sign contracts, and they can't be part of the social contract that forms your political system. And that's exactly what happens in these early democracies, is that blacks don't have any voting rights.
Many of the philosophers writing in this period played a crucial rationalizing role in justifying European imperialism, in justifying the domination of whites over people of color. So why is it then that these things are not more widely known? Why has the Kant establishment not taken up this issue? The marginalization of issues like this sort of goes in tandem with the sanitized view of mainstream philosophers, so that you represent Locke, you represent Kant, you represent Hegel, you represent these people in ways that does not address the sort of racist dimensions of their thought, and that sort of contributes to a picture of the modern period from which race has been whitewashed out.
In the name of their Majesties, Ferdinand and Isabella, King and Queen of Castile, Leon and Aragon, I now take possession of this land and name it San Salvador.
In spite of the atrocities perpetrated by the Spanish and Portuguese after the discovery of the New World, the colonizers eventually developed a society that allowed Europeans to mix with Indians on a scale that was unthinkable in French and English North America. But in the South, it was expedient for the settlers. They had to multiply or die out, because there just weren't enough of them to go round.
The Spanish had a very different understanding of the Indians than the British did. I think from the earliest moments of settlement, Spaniards tended to regard Indians as people that they could fold into their social system. Not because they were nicer people, the Spanish necessarily, but because for a variety of reasons there were fewer white people in Spanish America. Because Spain never colonized America with anything like the number of colonists that England and eventually Britain brought over. The number of Spaniards, peninsulares as they were known, people from the Iberian Peninsula that actually came to Latin America, was much, much smaller.
One sees emerging in the period of the Enlightenment, in the latter part of the 18th century, as abolitionism is beginning to take root in that part of the world as well, a much more vigorous form of mixed race interaction that you find in other parts of the world. It's a different tradition coming out of Southern European colonization, Portuguese on one hand, Spanish on the other, and out of this a greater willingness to engage in forms of mixed interaction, mixed intercourse, and identified and acknowledged mixed race populations emerging. And out of this you get, in the last 30 years, really 1760 to 1790, in Mexico City in particular, but you also get versions of this in Peru and elsewhere, of what comes to be called casta painting, mixed race painting, caste painting you might even call it, which characterizes in explicit classificatory terms. And after all, classification is an emergent form of rationality of Enlightenment thinking. And that casta painting lays out the forms of offspring that emerge from certain kinds of mixture between what they call Spaniard and Indian on the one hand, Spaniard and black on the other, in other words, European or white, with other racial forms, Indian and African, and then mixtures as well with the mixtures of the mixtures, so to speak. So you get various gradations, and you might even call it degradations, of racial mixing that go from mestizo and so on.
But the color lines were not rigidly drawn between just two races, but you had at least one intermediate race, and mulattoes or brown people. The presence of the mulatto in those colonies, the importance of mulattoes in Brazil as an intermediate group, the importance of mestizos in Spanish colonies with a large Indian population, is something that I think does distinguish the United States with its basically two-category system. You're either white or you're black.
South America is very complex and fascinating. It's different, but it wasn't necessarily better. It's easy to be fooled by the system because you go there and you see blacks and whites among the poor mixing together, whereas they don't in the United States. Because what the U.S. did with this one-drop rule was to encourage a sense of solidarity among whites as a way of dividing them from blacks. And one reason you never had working-class solidarity in America is because the one-drop rule and the binary system of race is a powerful tool for dividing the working classes, between whites and blacks. And the lower down the system you go, the more economically vulnerable and marginal the white person is, the more he's inclined to be racist, because it's the only way in which he has some status. He's, at least I'm not black. And so the white poor and the black poor are totally against each other. So it became a perfect system of division. Latin American societies are far more racist at the top than the United States. I mean, the Brazilian military brass is completely white. The Brazilian political elite is, until recently, completely white. Whereas in the United States, the higher up you go now, because of civil rights laws and so on, the more integrated the population, and the American political elite is thoroughly integrated. I mean, the Secretary of State is black. You know, the Congressional Black Caucus is very powerful. Part of the reason for this is that the way black Americans took over the one-drop rule and turned it to their own ends for mobilization and solidarity. Whereas in Brazil, they go on about their racial democracy. All they mean by that is that white men were going to bed with black women and not feeling guilty about it, and producing mixed kids whom they great beauty queens. But the system remained viciously unequal. Brazil is the most unequal society in the Western world, and blacks are completely at the bottom. So it's a pernicious system. It's apartheid without apartheid laws. And at the top, it's thoroughly racist.
If contemporary democracies can be called racist, then it should come as no surprise that over 200 years ago, a very early democratic experiment in Sierra Leone went badly wrong. Freetown became the home of the black loyalists, ex-slaves who freed themselves by fighting for the British in the American War of Independence. But their freedom turned out to be very limited, because of the dictates of their former British masters.
To some extent, what's interesting about Sierra Leone is how accidental the whole story is. These people, in a sense, have become refugees and have become British because they'd actually crossed the lines during the American Revolution to fight for the British. So in 1775, the British governor of Virginia said that if black people who were slaves would cross lines, would leave their plantations, leave the Americans, if you like, and fight for him, for the British, they'd win their freedom. But the British weren't committed in any deep way during the American Revolution to racial equality or even to emancipation. It was a strategic military move.
When this colony was established in 1787, it was meant to be a free colony. But for a variety of reasons, it didn't work that way. The problems with the colony inhabitants really came to the forefront with the arrival of the Nova Scotian settlers. These were blacks who had helped the British during the American War of Independence, and they had been promised some land in Nova Scotia. They were called the Black Loyalists. Many of the promises that the British made to them were never fulfilled.
The tragedy of Sierra Leone in the 1790s is the difficulty, the almost impossibility, I guess, for whites of letting black people run the colony. I mean, it was constantly run by or overseen by white people. And black people, I think, didn't think that's how it was going to work out. They imagined they'd have much, much more power and authority. They wouldn't just be electing constables, they'd be running the colony. And that didn't happen.
These Nova Scotian settlers that came here had all the resources that would enable them to govern themselves as an independent people. They had black pastors, they had black politicians who had mobilized them in Canada to move over to Sierra Leone. So they really had the human resource to be able to govern themselves as a free and independent people.
You have a view that emerges at the same time and fuels abolitionism, the claim that those who are not European or of European descent are historically immature by contrast with those who are European or European settlers. Europeans see themselves as having the obligation, the burden to civilize. So I think it's still with us today. One sees it in relation to the invasion of Iraq, for example. We will come in and teach you how to govern yourselves because you haven't been able to govern yourselves hitherto.
It was really a great opportunity that was lost, because had these people been given the opportunity to govern themselves, it is possible that perhaps Sierra Leone would never have been colonized in the real sense of the word, and Sierra Leone could probably have been the first black African country to be free of colonial rule.
I believe there are a few events in my life which have not happened to many.
Olaudah Equiano, whose first slave name was Gustava Vassa, obtains his freedom in London and becomes a key figure in the abolitionist movement. His autobiography really becomes the transforming political document to the abolitionist movement.
Olaudah Equiano is just one of the great campaigners consigned to the margins of history, while William Wilberforce is represented as the all-conquering hero who abolished slavery. However, no matter which great abolitionist you choose, you will find even greater forces behind them, from the radical Christianity of the Quakers to the workers forming what would become the trades union movement.
The other thing about Equiano was he's the one who connected the artisans of the London Corresponding Society in 1792. He connected them with the steel workers, the coal miners, and the factory workers of Sheffield. And it was this conjunction of the industrial proletariat and the artisans of London which historians have often seen as the beginning of the English working class as a whole. But it was Olaudah Equiano who had brought them together.
The period where you see the most solidarity between enslaved Africans and the white working class, in Britain anyway, I think were the early years of the abolition movement. Starting in the late 1780s, hundreds of thousands of Britons signed petitions to Parliament against the slave trade. And amazingly, a lot of these petitions came from workers. There were 769 metal workers in Sheffield who signed a remarkable petition to Parliament that said, in effect, you might expect us to be in favor of the slave trade because we sell a lot of the wares we make to the captains of slave ships who use them as trading goods to buy slaves in Africa, but we want to express our solidarity with our African brethren, and we are told that they do not wish to be slaves.
It's a very slow movement, a kind of shifting of the kind of tectonic plates underneath Western life, late 18th century. And the shift is, Enlightenment writing and kind of changes in theological views. But those small tectonic changes produce tremendous changes above. And one of the things that they do is to open to question the very existence of the slave trade and slavery.
The decisive event that affected all of culture at the time has to be the first successful slave revolution in human history, and the successful break from European imperial powers. And that's the Haitian War of Independence that breaks out in August 1791.
It's one island, originally colonized by the Spanish, who effectively abandon the western portion of the island, which the French squat on and eventually create their own colony on, which they call Saint-Domingue. The other thing I think just to remember is that this was the most successful colony in the Americas. I mean, we think of it today as it's a poorest nation in the Americas. It's always talked about in those terms. At that time, it really was the richest site. It wasn't a nation of its own, but the richest colony in the Americas. The productivity was enormous. So for every, in a sense, empire in the Americas, in a sense, had their eye on it, would have loved to be able to take control of that sector of the economy. The beginning of the revolution happened really in the northern plain of Saint-Domingue, which really was this extremely industrialized zone in which there were these enormous sugar plantations. That's really where the revolution began, and I think that's important to remember as well, that these plantations, which were some of the most industrial sites in the world at the time, in terms of the combination of both agriculture and production, generated this revolution. It came out of these plantations. The first stage of the revolution in 1791 was essentially about the slaves establishing control over these plantation domains. They transformed these wealthy plantations into their camps. One of the most interesting things that African historians have suggested about the revolution is that one of the reasons it may have succeeded is that there were huge numbers of men who had served in armies in Africa, who had been soldiers in Africa, who had been enslaved as a result of after participating in wars in Africa, and they brought their military experience to Saint-Domingue.
1793, Britain and France went to war, and Britain saw a chance to do two things in one go: to seize this very wealthy territory for itself, away from its enemy France, and to suppress the slave revolt before it could spread to Jamaica, which was very close by. Huge British force headed for Saint-Domingue, and for 5 years they fought the rebel slaves there who came under the leadership of Toussaint Louverture, the great Haitian leader, and they lost.
The attempted repression of that revolt involved hundreds of thousands of English boys and young men who were shipped off to Haiti. And there they will meet at the other end of a bayonet or the other end of a machete, the historic indignation of slaves fighting for freedom. And it's a huge trauma to the English people.
This was a case where an army of rebel slaves had defeated the army of the world's superpower, which was also the world's greatest slave trading nation. And it was a great shock.
The same can be said of the French, right, who have also, who later lost against essentially the same troops when they tried to reestablish slavery. The British defeat was, in a sense, presaged the defeat of Napoleon's troops that would follow a few years later. This revolution seemed kind of unthinkable for a lot of thinkers. The idea that this was happening, in some ways, the idea that slaves would become generals and leaders of a revolution and would defeat these armies, it was just really hard to kind of fit into what they believed and what they saw. Now, a lot of people, of course, did think about it and brought it into their reality. But I think it challenged at the time and continues to challenge so many of our notions about where history is made, how history is made, who are the central actors in history. This is really one of the foundational moments in the history of not just the Americas politically, but in democratic theorizing, of philosophy, of thinking about what rights are. So not only do you have a challenge to racist ideas that kind of consign people to the margins of history rather than placing them at the center, but you also have to rethink, I think, a lot of broader narratives about Western history.
What's interesting about the Haitian Revolution is that it's the only revolution with the only constitution that outlaws slavery and outlaws discrimination on the basis of race. Now that is historic. That's not in the Bill of Rights in the US. It's not part of the unwritten constitution of the British Empire. But it's part of that history of opposing racism, which actually comes from the enslaved themselves, and not from the so-called humanitarian efforts of the abolitionist movement, which couldn't have been successful unless the slaves themselves were making slavery unstable.
The cost they paid for it was a terrible one, because there was this international boycott of Haiti, and in the end they had to pay reparations. So it's not that reparations were paid to the slaves. They had to pay reparations to the French for property expropriated and so forth. I mean, one of the reasons that Haiti is today the poorest country in the Western Hemisphere comes out of this, that they do this tremendous historical feat. So here's the only successful slave revolution in history, and basically, okay, we are going to make sure that the contagion of your example does not spread to the United States, does not spread to Latin America. We're going to isolate you, we're going to quarantine you, we're going to make you pay.
Slavery itself isn't abolished in the British Islands until 1833. And indeed, there are still Africans carried across the Atlantic to Cuba and Brazil, illicitly, another more than 1 million. And slavery doesn't end in America till the Civil War, it doesn't end in Cuba and Brazil till 1888.
The sad truth of many situations like this, where there's a huge change on paper, a huge change on paper doesn't change people's material conditions of life. Because what happened was British slaves finally became officially free, August 1st, 1838, but for almost all of them, there was no work available except continuing to cut sugarcane. And now they suddenly found themselves having to pay rent to the planters for the miserable huts that they lived in, and taxes to the government.
And there were also all kinds of other strategies used essentially to prevent former slaves from gaining access to land, to prevent them from gaining access to the cities, to prevent them from gaining access to the professions and so forth. So there were all kinds of other strategies, all of them really largely tied together by a broader racial order that also kind of sustained a certain kind of subordination without slavery.
Many of the abolitionists could see that it was unjust and it was cruel to perpetuate a system where people were enslaved and degraded. But that did not necessarily mean that they saw those people who were degraded and enslaved as civilized like them. So there is a disconnect. And it's a disconnect that has to be marked and given some significance, because historically we often think that abolitionism was like an anti-racist movement. It wasn't an anti-racist movement. You know, Britain moved out of slavery straight into a wider and deeper colonial empire.
I think it's important that the British try and temper their sense of themselves and the sense of their past with an awareness that their history is not all drums and trumpetry. It's not all the kind of glories. It comes with a kind of a rather dark stain to it, a rather dark side to it. What's Rule Britannia about? Written in the 1740s, when Britain did rule the waves, but in the 1740s the British are carrying 40,000 Africans a year across the Atlantic. Never will be slaves. Britain never will be slaves.
Of course, the end of slavery opened up all kinds of possibilities for contestation that simply were not there before. So I think the change was crucial, and ex-slaves mobilized political institutions, legal institutions, religious institutions, and were able to do so and kind of push forward. But it is striking, I think, that in a sense the struggle to really bring about a complete end or complete erasure of all the effects and legacies of slavery is still continuing in a lot of ways.
Chancellor Gordon Brown has come to India to talk about trade and jobs, but instead he's having to reassure his hosts that Britain's not a racist country.
I think we want to send a message, as I know most British people want. We are a nation of fairness and tolerance, and that is how I think most of the world want to understand it.
His fear was that a row about Britain's past, if you like, about attitudes that many people thought should have gone and had gone, might actually hamper our future.
From deep within the dunes of Africa's Namib Desert, a terrible secret is beginning to emerge. These are the remains of victims of the world's first death camp. A place where thousands of Africans were exterminated by the German army 30 years before the Nazis came to power. These remains have lain here forgotten for over 100 years. But this terrible place is not unique. Scattered across the world are the sites of the massacres and genocides of imperialism, where millions died in an aspect of colonial history that Europe often chooses to forget. These people were victims of the truth that lies behind the myth of the white man's burden. Throughout the 19th century, European scientists, writers and philosophers developed ideas to justify the mass killings of the Age of Empire. These same theories went on to inspire some of the horrors and the savagery that would consume Europe in the 20th century. The 19th century was to end with the worst crimes of empire, but it began with a great moment of optimism. In the 1830s, in the great plantations of the Caribbean, Britain prepared to become the first nation to end slavery. 750,000 slaves across the Caribbean were about to be freed, and as Britain basked in her sense of national benevolence, it was presumed that the grateful slaves would transform themselves into a hard-working and Christian peasantry. The battle against slavery had been led from the pulpit by an alliance of Christian abolitionists and missionaries. They had fought the campaign from their churches and meeting halls. In the 1830s, it was their views that dominated the national debate on race.
When slavery was finally abolished, there would have been an enormous sense of elation and achievement on the part of the abolitionists. Don't forget, this was a 50-year campaign from 1787 onwards, involving hundreds of thousands of ordinary British people, petitions, etc. So that when slavery was abolished, the abolitionists had won a sort of sense of triumph. I think they also felt that that question, am I not a man and a brother, was answered.
The abolitionist response to that great question was that although men and brothers, black people were lesser men and lesser brothers.
I think in that moment, the dominant perspective is of a hierarchical racial order, but one in which it's a question of culture and civilization. They certainly do not think that black people are equal to them at this time. They think maybe at some time in the future they will be equal.
The mission to raise up the black and brown peoples of the world to the supposedly superior level of white Englishmen was not to be confined to the former slaves. This was to be the great task that would justify the expansion of the British Empire.
The abolitionists satisfied one aspect of their tutelage and governance of black people, in that they fought and won for the freedom of black people. The next step was to send your stormtroopers, your missionaries, into Africa and the Caribbean to finish off the job, as it were. You know, these are heathens who have to be brought into the fold of Christianity. That notion of giving civilized values and modes of behavior to other peoples, that's the ideology that underpinned the empire.
In the empire that the missionaries and abolitionists set out to create, indigenous peoples would see their cultures destroyed and their religions eradicated. And yet all this seems almost benign when compared with the grim reality of what imperialism became. Because during the 19th century, their dream was gradually overwhelmed by another vision. One that claimed that the dark races could not be civilized and should instead be exterminated. The event that began the slow collapse of the missionaries' vision took place in a then little-known outpost of Britain's vast and expanding empire. This is Tasmania, on the southern coast of Australia. What the British did on this small island was to resonate down through the Victorian age. When the British started to settle in Tasmania in 1803, they encountered the ancient Aboriginal peoples of the island. Only 5,000 strong, they had lived in complete isolation for 10,000 years, on the very edge of the habitable world. The settlers saw these people through ideas brought with them from Europe.
Quite early you get expressions of disgust and shock about the way the Tasmanians lived. To the Europeans it appeared that the Tasmanians were without culture, they were without religion, they were godless. So they looked upon the Tasmanians as people who'd been left behind by history. And they also related to a very popular idea of the late 18th century, that is the great chain of being, that the various races of humankind were arranged in hierarchical order, and that the Tasmanians were uniquely savage and primitive, and therefore can be treated almost as animals.
The British set about building a new capital and settling the surrounding countryside, land that for millennia had been the prime hunting ground of the Aboriginals. Out in these fields and pastures, far from the control of the authorities, the settlers were free to displace and abuse the Aboriginals.
From the 1820s, huge amount of Aboriginal land has been taken up, and there is this enormous struggle between Aboriginal people and whites. Of course, it's very hard to document a lot of the settler violence because they know that it is against the law to kill Aboriginal people. They are being told that Aboriginal people are British subjects, but they certainly reveal in their diaries and journals the desire to kill Aboriginal people.
What became known as the Black War was a hidden conflict. The landscape itself was the only witness. The British settlers killed any Aboriginals they encountered. Whole groups were massacred. Kidnapping and rape became commonplace. The Aboriginals regularly attacked the settlers as they fought desperately to defend their land. And as the death toll rose, fear fused with hatred.
In such circumstances, it was very easy, on both sides no doubt, to regard the other side as being totally subhuman. I've got no doubt that the Aborigines thought the Europeans were people totally without morality or without any restraint. Equally, the Europeans slipped very quickly into a view that these people were animals and savages. So that conflict in such a racially divided society so easily tips over into an extreme feeling of hatred.
The death toll of the Black War had terrifying implications for the Tasmanian Aboriginals. The British, who arrived in ever-increasing numbers, could replace their dead. But the Aboriginals, only 5,000 strong before the war, could not. And by the end of the 1820s, they were at risk of being completely annihilated. The only man who had any hope of halting the violence was the colonial governor, George Arthur.
Now, the governor of Tasmania is an evangelical. He knows Wilberforce, and he is aware that his future and his reputation depends on how he deals with this problem above all else. Now, he's already been warned in the late 1820s by the British government that the rapidly declining numbers suggests that these people might be exterminated. And were this to happen, it would be an indelible stain on the reputation of the British Empire, but by implication it would be disastrous for his career.
Governor Arthur set out to save the Aboriginals from the violence of the settlers, And to convince them of his good intentions, he produced a poster that was attached to trees in their homelands. It showed a fantasy of interracial unity. The poster spoke of British justice, promising equality before the law. The white killer of an Aboriginal would be hanged. If an Aboriginal killed a settler, he would be hanged. The poster also propagated the lie that the British wanted to integrate with the Aboriginals. It was both a fiction and a complete failure, because out in the bush, the killings on both sides continued. And in 1830, Governor Arthur embarked upon a new policy. He ordered the army to sweep across the area of European settlement in an attempt to capture the remaining Aboriginals. He offered a bounty for every Aboriginal taken alive, but the operation was a complete failure. Only 2 were captured, an old man and a young boy. After years of guerrilla warfare, the last few hundred of the original 5,000 Aboriginals had learnt to hide themselves in the bush. Determined to save them, and determined to take their land for white settlement, Governor Arthur changed tactics. He now turned away from the army and looked instead to a missionary, George Augustus Robinson. He was the leader of a band of Aboriginal converts and was now hired to go into the bush and bring in the remaining Aboriginals.
Robinson took a message that the government wanted to come to some sort of an agreement, a negotiation, a peace treaty. And that is, I believe, undoubtedly the way the Aborigines saw it. They too saw this as a way to end a conflict which they had realised they could never win. They could never get rid of the Europeans. If they stayed and fought, they would be wiped out. And Robinson and his intermediaries convinced them that they should temporarily go to an island where they will be looked after and fed, and that they will ultimately come back to their homelands.
The island was called Flinders Island, and 300 Tasmanian Aboriginals who had been collected by Robinson were transported here. Robinson came with them in the official role of Chief Protector of Aboriginals, a job for which he was paid a total of £8,000, a small fortune in the 1830s. A settlement was constructed for them, complete with houses, farmland and a chapel. Robinson called it Point Civilization, and a local artist was brought in to paint the portraits of the last of the Tasmanians. Ginny had been captured by Robinson following the near annihilation of her people by the settlers. Wuradi had been a chief until his community had been wiped out by a European virus. Another local leader, Manalagena, had been lured to Flinders Island with the promise that the convicts who had attacked his people would be brought to justice. And there was Truganini, whose husband had been murdered in front of her. All of them had seen their culture almost wiped out. What little was left, Robinson now set out to erase. Because Point Civilization was not merely a settlement, it was essentially a factory to transform so-called savages into civilized Christians.
To become a successful Christian, he believes, you have to settle down, you have to live in a village. He wants to send the children to school. He wants to teach them to plough and to sow and to become agriculturalists.
Forced to adopt an alien way of life and confined to an island hundreds of miles from home, they began to succumb to European diseases and what the local doctor called dejected spirits.
They die one by one by one. children are not being born. And there must have been this enormous sense of trauma amongst them. A people that had once been strong and healthy, suffering this enormous decline within a generation.
George Robinson, the supposed saviour of the Aboriginals, was reduced to sketching out his plan for their future graves.
Frequently he cries with the mourners, he weeps himself, he's so moved by their fate. But ultimately he says, well, it is better that they die here having learnt the message of the Gospels rather than be killed in the bush by the settlers. He finds a way to ease his own conscience so that Robinson's own beliefs, you see, protect him against a full accounting of what he was partly responsible for.
Of the 300 Aboriginals lured to Flinders Island by the mid-1840s, around 260 were dead. Ginny, Manalagena and Wiradi had all succumbed. Truganini was one of the few survivors. She lived on, growing into old age. When she finally died in 1876, she was regarded by some as being the last full-blooded Tasmanian. A people whose story could be traced back 10,000 years had, within the span of a single lifetime, been almost exterminated. What had happened in Tasmania was far from being a unique event. Across the world, indigenous peoples were being pushed to the brink of extinction. In the South African Cape, the Khoisan peoples had been driven from their land, enslaved and killed in their thousands by British settlers and the Boers. The same forces had also attacked the ancient San Bushmen of the Kalahari, hunting them down as if they were animals. In Newfoundland, the native Beothuk peoples had been completely wiped out by Europeans. And in South America, wars of extermination sanctioned by the Argentinian government were raging against the Pampas Indians. Everywhere, it seemed, white settlers were destroying indigenous peoples. And in these very same years, the old racism that had been born in the age of slavery began to re-emerge. In the aftermath of abolition, competition from new sugar producers began to undermine Britain's once mighty sugar plantations. And as their estates rotted, the former slave owners began to blame their ruin on the people who had once made them rich.
When the Caribbean plantations started to lose money in a big way, they fell back to the stereotype of the lazy Negro. The planters were then able to say to the abolitionists and to Britain, look, we are now in ruin because we no longer have the freedom to coerce blacks to work. We no longer have the freedom to drive them to work. These people are intrinsically lazy. You know, you were arguing that they were human beings, a man and a brother, but in fact they're not. They're still at the level of beasts.
Whereas up to the end of the 1830s, it's been pretty unpopular to talk about Africans in those ways, and the respectable talk of the humanitarians about Africans has been, you know, far more prevalent. By the mid-1840s, that's beginning to shift.
Those who argued that abolition had been a failure due to the laziness and savagery of the slaves now claim that the Christian vision of a civilizing empire was also doomed.
You might say that the moral momentum ran out of the abolitionist movement. People found that other races were not becoming civilized. There was something difficult. They fought back. They didn't seem to learn as fast as we would appreciate, to make them more pliable for us. Christian optimism about the spread of civilization and the Christianization of people of color around the world began to drain away.
If the non-white races seemed to reject the message of the missionaries, some in Britain began to ask if they could be civilized at all. One of those who thought not was the eminent writer and historian Thomas Carlyle. In 1849, Carlyle published an essay entitled Occasional Discourse on the Negro Question, in which he appealed for a return to some form of slavery. It was printed and reprinted in magazines across the world and helped transform the 19th century debate about race.
Carlyle's voice is a kind of prophetic voice, you know, which booms out from his study in Cheyne Walk in Chelsea, and he writes these, you know, extraordinarily powerful prophetic pieces which were read, you know, with gusto by Victorians, and they, I mean, one can imagine them all sitting around their fires reading the latest periodical that's come out with this flow of rhetoric. In this case, in the Occasional Discourse on the Negro Question, the flow of rhetoric is about the necessity for inequality. Inequality is the proper way to run a society. Those who know should rule those who don't know. Men should rule women, white people should rule black, educated people should rule the masses.
The depths to which these ideas became embedded within mid-Victorian society was revealed by one of the most controversial events of the whole 19th century. In 1865, the people of Morant Bay, a tiny settlement in East Jamaica, attacked a courthouse during a minor demonstration.
In return, the Governor-General imposed martial law and ordered his soldiers to go on a killing spree. It was a killing time. Nearly 500 people were just executed. 600 people just flogged, some of them to the point of death. And 1,000 homes torched. Enormous disparity in terms of the retaliation against these people. And you know, when all this was being done, the so-called rebels didn't put up a fight. You know, when their houses were being burned, they weren't terrorists, they weren't murderers, you know. All they wanted was for the judiciary to treat them with a sense of justice.
The man who ordered the killings was Governor Edward Eyre, and when news of what he had done reached Britain, the liberal establishment was shocked.
And the cause is taken up by the old abolitionists who've kept going and kept going and kept going, and the old anti-slavery societies kind of wrench themselves back into action and mobilize themselves again, and all the ladies who've been doing it for decades, when the men have gone off and done more interesting things, you know, there they are with the machinery still in place that can be mobilized when you need to.
Their tactic was to put Governor Eyre on trial for mass murder, but in court he was acquitted, due in part to a huge wave of popular support.
He had the whole of the House of Lords, parliamentarians, bishops, priests, the establishment, the aristocracy backing him, saying that he was justified in imposing severe order on these people because that's the only language they could understand, because the black people were brutes.
Eyre's defence was orchestrated by the high priest of the new racism, Thomas Carlyle. But behind him stood many members of the British literary elite, all of whom made known their support for Governor Eyre and his actions at Morant Bay. The art critic and writer John Ruskin, the author of Vanity Fair, William Makepeace Thackeray, the Reverend Charles Kingsley, writer of the children's classic The Water Babies, and Charles Dickens, the most celebrated author of the century.
The notion of treating other people with some degree of justice and rule of law finally went out of the window. and was demolished in the 1860s over Morant Bay. You know, from then on we knew that the empire was about ruling people with the maximum degree of coercion.
Some of the new ideas about race in the high Victorian age drew their evidence from the world of the dead. Based on the study of corpses and skeletons, the burgeoning science of anatomy laid the foundations for a new scientific racism. In Britain, the most important race scientist was a now forgotten Edinburgh surgeon. Ruined by a body-snatching scandal in the 1820s, he had fled Britain in disgrace. But in the 1840s, Dr. Robert Knox resurfaced with the publication of a new book.
Race is everything. Literature, science, art, in a word, civilization depends on it.
For Robert Knox in that book, race is everything. It determined your character, it determined your position in civilization, it determined your destiny.
Can the black races become civilized? I should say not.
He saw racial conflict and extermination happening all around the world. It was natural for him to believe that racial types were bound to struggle and that the superior races would dominate the naturally inferior ones.
The Saxon race will never tolerate them, never amalgamate, never be at peace. It is a war of extermination. One or other must fall.
Robert Knox was not a lone voice. In America, a group led by the renowned craniologist Samuel George Morton had begun to collect the skulls of different races and compare them.
Skulls were chosen to be measured because it was reckoned that the skull was the container of the most important part of the human body, the brain. The bigger the skull, the bigger the brain. The shape of the skull, the shape of the brain.
The American School of Race Scientists concluded that the races, as measured through their skulls, were so different as to be separate species. Tasmanians, Africans, American Indians were not the lower races of men. They were perhaps not fully human at all. One writer compared the extermination of these races by white settlers as being like the melting of snow before the advancing rays of the sun. But the theory that was to have the most powerful impact upon race came not from the anatomists or the skull measurers, but from the work of one of the 19th century's greatest minds.
The Origin of Species really threw a bombshell, first of all into science. It really invented the science of biology, and then into religion and into society. And what Darwin did in some ways was to give an alibi for being a judge. If evolution had changed the races and the species of the world, why hadn't it done the same to humans?
Many believed that Darwin's laws had done just that. Natural selection, they claimed, neatly explained and justified the global expansion of the great British race.
Life favors a hierarchy of specialists. And you find that throughout the plant and the animal world. There are bugs on top of bugs on top of bugs, each one surviving at another's expense, each one filling a niche that another can't occupy. People, Darwin said, are the same way. They are expansive organisms. In other words, Englishmen are just like other organisms. They are successful because they are good at expanding.
Those who understood colonialism and human competition in terms of Darwin's theories became known as the social Darwinists. Men like the radical biologist Thomas Henry Huxley and the famous economist Herbert Spencer. and social Darwinism foresaw very different fates for the various races of mankind.
Evolution was in operation. It was advancing the most recently evolved, the most successfully evolved, that is, the Northern Europeans, the British. But evolution also suggested that there had to be losers in this great cosmic process. And the losers were those peoples who could not compete. And once put into competition with superior races, were doomed to disappear. And this was likely to happen to all the native peoples in North America, in the Pacific, and in Africa.
Across the world, the crimes of imperialism now came to be taken as proof that the social Darwinists were right. In North America, centuries of disease and war had devastated the Native Americans. Whole nations had been all but annihilated. In parts of the Australian mainland, the peoples of the outback were, it seemed, going the same way as their cousins in Tasmania. And across Africa, the scramble for empire had brought the might of Europe to bear against innumerable peoples, killing literally millions. The social Darwinists predicted a future in which these races, like many animal species, would only be remembered as curios, stuffed exhibits in anthropological museums. The white man's burden and the Christian dream of benign imperialism were rendered obsolete.
Old missionaries who still talked about the equality of humanity and talked about everyone descended from Adam and Eve and talked about that the truth, the only truth, came from the Bible, were seen as being extraordinarily old-fashioned, who simply had failed to come to terms with the great scientific thinking of the age.
And these racial theories were not only applied in new colonies, but also in the oldest parts of the empire. In the traditional story of imperialism, British India has usually been represented as an example of benign imperial rule. The British Raj, we are told, was run by men who were competent, professional and wise, men who brought order and prosperity to a chaotic land. But there is an aspect of Indian history that has been written out of this account of the imperial past. In the mid-1870s, the Great Deccan Plain of India was affected by the climatic phenomenon we now know as El Niño, and within months, millions of peasants had begun to starve.
The monsoons had failed, people had eaten their food reserves. India stood on the precipice of a great human tragedy. At this point, the Viceroy of India, Lord Lytton, was totally absorbed in what was probably the largest party in world history, celebrating the coronation of Queen Victoria as Empress of India. This is one of the great catering feats in history, since it meant wining and dining more than 60,000 satraps and princes and retainers and friends of the British Empire in India over the course of a long week.
As Lord Lytton and the ruling elite of the Raj feasted at banquets and posed for official photographs, millions were slowly dying in the countryside, and the Viceroy justified his inaction with arguments gleaned from the social Darwinists.
This was a very, very crass use of a Darwinian evolutionary notion of survival of the fittest, whereby a famine could be actually seen as an instrument of Darwinian winnowing. Yes, that people who were unfit would effectively perish as a result of this, and to intervene to stop them perishing was really to interfere with almost a rule of nature.
What made the famines especially deadly was that the British had dismantled ancient systems that had for centuries prevented food shortages from turning into famines.
if you'd had a poor monsoon and there was a food shortage, many people still had enough. They may have had less, but they would have had enough because they grew their own food, or they would have had access to it from other groups in the community who would share it with them during a time of crisis.
All this had been wiped away when the British forced the poorest peasants to grow cash crops like wheat and rice for export, thereby ushering them into a global market. And in the 1870s, that market condemned them to death. By 1877, millions in southern and central India were starving. In desperation, parents sold their children for scraps of food. Many thousands committed suicide, and in some places, the people were forced into cannibalism. And all the while, the food that could have saved them was piled up on the docks of Madras, ready to be shipped to Britain and America. But to Lord Lytton, it was no more than an unfortunate byproduct of the iron laws of social Darwinism.
If you read the letters of Lord Lytton, what is so striking about them is not simply their fanatical devotion to the market and market forces. It's not simply their parsimony and desire to spend as little as possible, but the enormous calm with which they accept the fact that millions of Indians would die, because these are Indians they believe are the useless part of the population, the poorest of the poor, people condemned to death by nature.
When finally Lytton was pressured into action, his solution proved just as deadly as the famine itself. Lord
Lytton sets up a system of outdoor relief that looks more like Nazi concentration camps than anything representing decent human charity. First of all, there's the obligatory test. You can't be relieved, that is, given a job or food within 10 miles of your residence. You must walk, and you must walk sometimes distances of hundreds of kilometers, and tens of thousands of people die in the course of that. Then you're put to work doing heavy labor, very heavy labor, breaking stone, working on the railroads, and you're confined then to squalid camps where your daily diet is in caloric terms less than that provided to inmates of Buchenwald and other Nazi concentration camps. They become literally and simply death camps. And perhaps worst of all, children were now too weak and small to do the necessary work. Children became the main victims of Lytton's cool-hearted policy.
8 million Indians died in the famines of the 1870s. But they were not the only famines of the British Raj, and they were not the last. Famines returned in the 1880s and the 1890s, and in all, almost 30 million Indians starved to death under British rule. A story airbrushed out of the glorious accounts of the Raj and the men who ruled over it. Social Darwinism had justified genocidal policies in the colonies, and in the same years it also fueled new fears amongst the British elite, fears of other dangerous races living in their midst, the working classes of their own cities.
Race and class are actually very close to each other. If you look at books about race around Darwin's time, they often talk about the Cockney race, the English country race, the Scottish race. There were drawings of the head of a typical member of the Cockney race, and the word was used quite seriously. There were maps made of where the criminal races lived. These were the rookeries. This was the East End, the melting pot of all the horrors that were going to go out and infect the rest of the population.
Race scientists and social reformers visited prisons to study the criminal races at first hand, and among them was Charles Darwin's cousin, Francis Galton. Galton was terrified by the fact that the underclass were reproducing faster than the middle classes. Darwinian law had, it seemed, been turned on its head. The least fit were surviving. Reversing this situation became his mission.
Darwin had looked backwards. Where had we come from? Galton turned the telescope around and looked forward. Where were we going? And he devoted much of the rest of his life to the idea of understanding Homo sapiens, us, as a species, and trying to direct where Homo sapiens was going to go in order to become more sapient, more wise in the future, more of a genius, and less of what he saw, more stupid, more ignorant, and more decayed.
Galton designed a new science of human selective breeding. He dreamed of encouraging the middle classes to have more children and inhibiting breeding amongst the lower and criminal classes. And he named his new science eugenics. In the last decades of the 19th century, it became widely respected, attracting an array of high-profile supporters.
They included many of the great figures of the late 19th, early 20th century, people like George Bernard Shaw, H.G. Wells, Winston Churchill, all of them absolutely convinced eugenicists.
In the first years of the 20th century, all the racial theories developed in the Victorian age, eugenics, social Darwinism and scientific racism, came together in a forgotten outpost of colonialism. This is Namibia, but at the dawn of the 20th century, it was the German colony of southwest Africa, and home to an ancient people called the Herero. In 1904, they rebelled against the brutality of German rule. What followed was to prefigure the worst crimes of the 20th century. The Germans committed innumerable massacres and atrocities, but they were unable to hunt down and destroy all the Herero people across such a vast landscape. And when the Nama, another of the Namibian peoples, rose up, the Germans turned instead to a recent invention, the concentration camp. In these camps, the Herero and Nama were imprisoned and enslaved. Thousands were worked to death, others raped, beaten, or simply murdered by the guards. The most infamous and deadly of the camps was at a place called Shark Island.
Shark Island was established for the express purpose of killing people. Anybody placed on that island, everybody knew they were going to die. People knew that, the German officers knew that. If I were to have to use the language of the Nazi period, then I would certainly see Shark Island as a death camp.
The people were band together in Shark Island from all over Namibia. Hereros, Tamaras, Bushman, Nama. And they had cool-blooded murder there. My own family, my ancestors, they were also killed there.
In this desolate place, on the southern edge of Africa, 3,500 people were exterminated, with the speed and efficiency that was to become the hallmark of 20th century slaughter.
The genocides which took place in Namibia in 1904 to 1909, they are the precursor to what happens in the Nazi period. They are the precursor. They have the same symptoms in the sense that you can see the bureaucratization of mass killing. And this, for me, is the central thing. It's not just killing for killing. No. It's a combination between killing and bureaucracy.
Today, Shark Island is a campsite for tourists. The Africans who were frozen and starved to death here have been almost erased from memory. But a century after the Namibian genocide, the true horror of what happened on Shark Island is beginning to re-emerge. In a recently discovered mass grave, just a few kilometers from the site of Shark Island, lie some of the victims of the 20th century's first genocide. Other victims were denied even the meager dignity of a mass grave. They became the raw material of racial science. Their skulls, and even severed heads, were sold to museums in Europe and used to prove the inferiority of Africans. The trade in skulls was so accepted that it was even depicted on a postcard. In the aftermath of the genocide, German racial scientists continued to use Namibia as a field laboratory and the African peoples who had survived as their subjects. In 1908, a eugenicist called Eugen Fischer travelled to the small town of Rehoboth, home to a people of mixed Boer and African heritage who called themselves the Rehoboth Bastards. Fischer and his assistants spent months photographing, measuring, and examining the inhabitants of this town, people whose descendants still live here.
The person at the bottom there is my grandfather, Malcolm McNabb, and above him is his brother, Charles McNabb. My grandfather used to talk a lot about what they did, measurements, the eyes, the nose, the lips, the ears, hair, etc. They was not aware of the nature of the experiment.
Lying in the vaults of an archive in modern-day Namibia, Eugen Fischer's original files and photographs remain as he left them a century ago. They reveal his methods and also his aims.
Here Eugen Fischer has lined the different pictures up next to each other to try to trace very specific facial features like the eyes or the noses. And the reason he's done this is to try to show how very specific African facial features like high cheekbones and the drawn-out eyes that represent the African genes are very prominent and become more prominent through the generations. Eugen Fischer came to Namibia to prove one basic point, and that was that racial mixing was always bad, and that the African gene is dominant over the white gene.
Fischer's work in Rehoboth sealed his reputation as one of Germany's leading racial scientists. It also brought him recognition from a nation that was then experiencing the greatest influx of immigration the world had ever seen. In the first years of the 20th century, the ethnic makeup of America was being transformed as millions of immigrants poured into her great cities. Many of those who feared that mass immigration would lead to widespread racial mixing looked to the ideas of eugenics, an increasingly powerful science.
Eugenics flourished, mutated, and went out of control when it got to the United States. And the irony is that the eugenics movement in the United States, which certainly descended directly from Galton, had the great advantage of having a lot of money, a huge amount of money.
Some of that money was used to establish the Eugenics Records Office, ran by the infamous Charles Davenport. In order to defend the health and purity of the white race, Davenport and his followers sought to identify those classes and those races in America whom they considered genetically unfit. Identified and monitored, the scientists would then take control of their lives and their fertility.
Once you were identified as a certain class, it meant what school you could go to, what cemetery you could be buried in, where you could live. It was a matter of life and death. Marriage laws were established in dozens of states around the United States, saying that people could not marry outside of their group. Blacks could not marry whites, Indians could not marry blacks. In Virginia, if you married the wrong person, meaning interracial marriage, they would unmarry you. They would invalidate your marriage.
27 states passed eugenics marriage laws, and the eugenicists spread their message using the new medium of cinema. The propaganda was intended to protect the genetic health of the white race. This would be achieved by eradicating those deemed unworthy through forced mass sterilization.
They went about methodically tracking ancestry and targeting bloodlines for extinction. That's eugenics, the effort to create a white, master, blonde, blue-eyed master race by wiping out other bloodlines until they were left only with themselves and people who resembled themselves. And what's important here is that these people thought they were saving humanity. These people thought they were liberals. They were reformers.
Eugenics was a worldwide movement. In Sweden, an official program forcibly sterilized 60,000 people, mental patients and members of the ethnic minorities. In Britain, the Eugenics Society received widespread support from across the political spectrum. But it was in Germany that the radical ideas of the American eugenics movement found its most receptive audience.
Anything connected to America would seem to be modern, progressive, scientific, democratic, reasonable, so it must be good. America was the future, the force of the future. Secondly, I think that many European eugenicists, including the Germans, liked the tone adopted by American eugenicists, which was very radical and sort of no-nonsense, and they didn't use euphemisms. They said exactly what they meant.
The Americans provided more than just inspiration. American foundations also bankrolled the development of German eugenics. This was the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute of Anthropology and Human Heredity. In the 1930s, the men and women who worked here received grants from the American Rockefeller Foundation. And the leading scientist here was the man who made his name in Namibia, Eugen Fischer. Under the Nazis, Fischer was empowered to sterilize the racially mixed people of Germany's Rhineland, 400 of them, all children. The majority of those sterilized by the Nazis before 1939, however, were the mentally ill. But when the Nazis began their war, they abandoned sterilization in favor of adult euthanasia, the Nazi euphemism for murder. The victims of this program were amongst the first people gassed by the Nazis, but the program wasn't restricted to the mentally ill.
When they have killed the target figure of mental patients they want to kill, which is roughly 70,000 people, they slightly exceeded it. So the first thing they do then is to contact the SS, who have large numbers of what they deem to be sick concentration camp prisoners. In other words, people who might have wear glasses or be myopic or have a wooden leg or something. So they want them out of the way. So these people oblige and they take 15 or 20,000 people from the concentration camps and kill them on behalf of the SS. It's a bit like sort of contract work. And then when the SS and other people have decided they're going to go for the big project, which is to kill the Jewish population of Europe, and in particular that of Poland, which is the biggest population they're concerned with, then those people push themselves forward and say, well, hey, we can do this, we've done it, we have a record of doing this, we murder people, and they become the core personnel in all the big extermination camps.
These killing centres were the second network of concentration camps and death camps in German history. And the experts in eugenics, or race hygiene as the Germans called it, were involved not just in their day-to-day running, but also in the highest levels of planning.
It's worth reminding ourselves that the Wannsee Conference, which was the one that set up the plan for the final solution, almost half the people around that table had doctorates, PhDs, in race hygiene, or genetics, as we'd say today. So there really is a genuine link between the Galtonian agenda and the horrors which happened in Germany.
The German experts in race hygiene who assembled here at the Wannsee Villa outside Berlin dreamed of racial genocide, just like their spiritual predecessors, the race scientists and the social Darwinists of the Age of Empire. But the colonial genocides, inspired and justified by the 19th century theorists, have been written out of Europe's history. The horrors of the Shark Island death camp, the destruction of the Tasmanian Aboriginals, the 30 million victims of the Indian famines, all have been forgotten. The erasure of this memory encourages the belief that Nazi violence was an aberration in European history. Though the Holocaust itself was motivated by the fanatical anti-Semitism of the Nazis, it can also be seen as part of a longer historical continuum, one that identifies it as a logical extension of scientific racism. But this history, like the bones in the Namibian deserts, refuses to remain buried forever.
In 15 or 20 years' time, the black man will have the whip hand over the white man.
In 1865, when the enslavement of African Americans came to an end, many believed that a new era of liberty and justice was dawning. Yet by the start of the 20th century, these hopes looked forlorn. Black people were denied the vote and remained impoverished. Black people were victims of violence and murder. Across America, resistance to racism was met with deadly force. At the same time, as Europe's nations built empires across the globe, Africans and Asians were being stripped of their land and brutalized. In the West, Popular culture reinforced the idea of a racial hierarchy and white supremacy by ridiculing black people. Throughout the 20th century, from the Mississippi cotton fields and South African diamond mines, a tale of exploitation and racial violence unfolds. Many people would lose their lives resisting, fighting battles that continue in many countries today. The campaign to abolish slavery in the United States had drawn support from all over the world. Abolition was acclaimed as a triumph for all humanity. But soon black Americans would realize that racism had outlived slavery. Near the end of the Civil War, the Northern Union Army had promised 40 acres to each freed slave who would fight the Southern Confederate Army. But the following year, the order was rescinded, and the lands were returned to the white plantation owners of the South, leaving many with no choice but to work for their former masters. They became farm laborers as part of a system known as sharecropping.
The way it worked is that a black family would work for a white landlord for a period of a year. And during that time, the family would receive canned goods, food, a plow, mules, animals, seeds, other implements that were necessary to produce a cash crop, let's say cotton. And the split was half, 50-50, minus the costs that had been incurred during the previous growing season by the black family. And what usually occurred, since the black household did not keep the books, blacks owed more money at the end of the year to white families, and so the debt was rolled over. Blacks essentially never got out of debt.
After the Civil War, the 13th and 14th Amendments to the Constitution outlawed slavery and extended the vote to adult black men. But in the South, these hard-won rights were thwarted.
What they did was to find ways to stop black people from voting. They created literacy tests, basically. They said, or other exams that you had to pass in order to be allowed to vote. And a white person would show up and they would be asked, what country is this? And they would say, United States, go ahead, vote. And then a black person would show up and they'd first of all see if they could read. And if they could read, they would then ask them a question like, what is the third phrase in the First Amendment governing religion? Which, of course, most white people couldn't have answered either.
By the end of the 19th century, the southern states made it legal to offer so-called separate but equal services to their black citizens. These laws denied black Americans equal access to public amenities, such as education and transport, turning the United States into a racially segregated nation. Soon, millions living in the land of the free found themselves trapped by the Jim Crow system, named after a vaudeville act that ridiculed black people.
The key thing to grasp about the so-called Jim Crow laws is that they were really about enforcing the idea of racial inequality in everyday life. And so there were laws that explicitly governed things like where black people could sit in buses, whether they could stay in hotels, which hotels they could stay in, whether they could eat in the same places, and so on. But also around them was a set of practices of everyday life which were not legally enforceable, but which reflected the very same ideas. So, for example, black people weren't supposed to look white people in the face in the street. I mean, if there was not enough space on the pavement, the black person was supposed to get off. Or in the end, if you looked in the wrong place, if you did what was once called reckless eyeballing, if a black man looked at a white woman in the wrong way, he could end up being lynched.
Jim Crow, legal racial segregation, was a regime of white over black, and that the heart of Jim Crow was violence. And violence took several different forms, but the chief form it took was lynching. Between 1882 to about 1927, 3,500 African Americans were lynched in the United States. Jim Crow was a system of political and economic terror. Slavery was always a kind of perverse blessing for blacks in the sense that they were defined as property. In the early 1850s, a 21-year-old black man, a field hand, was worth $1,000. And so whites had a vested interest, perhaps to beat their slaves, but not to kill them.
The fear that white people had of black people was so deeply internalized and reinforced by church and government and business that black town halls were burned, black churches were burned. And if a black man defended himself against the aggressor, against a white man, not only could he be killed, but his family could be killed. He might be subjected to hours of torture. In some cases, more than one, a black man was tied on a log and burned from his feet up so that an extensive crowd of people could take pleasure out of the screams and the horror.
At his home near Savannah, Georgia, James Allen has collected a photographic record of racial violence in the South. For the past 20 years, he's found horrifying pictures in the family albums of ordinary Southern homes. Many are postcards that were mass-produced as souvenirs.
Some of these images were printed in the tens of thousands and sold for a dime or $1 a piece. Some of the postcards tell you where to write and the discounts you'll get if you buy 1, 10, or 100. They were sold in drugstores and pharmacies. They were sold on the street. I purchased a photograph from a woman. The photographer sold them door to door. Her mother bought the image for $2. A murder that is of particular interest to me was of a 17-year-old boy by the name of Jess Washington in Waco, Texas, in 1916. He was seriously mentally challenged. The wife of the farmer that he worked for was found dead. He was arrested. He was brought to trial. The trial took from 10 until 12. And when the jury came back at noon and found him guilty, someone in the courtroom, and it would have been anyone in the courtroom, screamed out, "Get that nigger." Then one of the worst and cruelest treatments of a human being began. Jess was kicked down out of the courthouse, down the back steps where a crowd of several hundred was waiting for him. They put a chain on his neck. There were 16,000 people crowding the street to watch this boy be tortured. Jess was tied to the chain over a branch of a tree. The fire was started. They raised Jess from the fire up into the air so that the crowd could see him. there were cheers, like at a football game, cheering the torturers on. When Jess tried to climb up the chains, hand by hand, they cut his fingers off one by one, so that all he could do was slap at the chain. They lowered him back down in the fire. A man came up and castrated him. Another man kept a pole so that he couldn't crawl out of the fire. And time and again they pulled him up to keep him from dying so that the crowd could be satisfied. Until he finally died.
Many of these murders were instigated by America's most powerful agent of racial terror. At its peak, the Ku Klux Klan had up to 5 million members. An average of 2 lynchings every week resulted. The Klan was just one source of racial violence. Scores of black Americans were killed during the Red Summer riots of 1919. More bloodshed followed 2 years later in Tulsa, Oklahoma. Over 300 people were killed and thousands were left homeless after envious white people attacked the city's most prosperous black community. Much of this history of racial violence has been erased from public memory. Several state archives have cut out photographs and newspaper reports of lynchings. And James Allen's attempts to show his collection in Atlanta's leading academic institutions have been repeatedly blocked.
White America has maintained to this day control of the history of racial violence as victors. It's as if we live in an occupied country intellectually. And as long as white America maintains the power and maintains the myth of moral superiority, the history will never become public, fully public, and be written into our national conscience.
Violence was just one way of maintaining the racial hierarchy. Newspapers, film and theatre stereotyped black people as simple-minded figures of fun. Some black performers applied minstrel makeup to caricature themselves as shuffling Negroes, reinforcing the sense of superiority amongst white audiences.
What it really essentially said about black people is that we were outside of the pale of civilization. So to pillory and to make blacks buffoons is to deny them human capacity. And for whites, it was a grand old time. And for the first half of the 20th century, minstrelsy and blackface was not just reputable, but it was a central feature of entertainment in America.
Everywhere you looked, black people were being portrayed as dense, incompetent, irrational savages. In vaudeville and on stage, African-American people were reduced to silly, childlike characters who needed to be trained like a monkey. Thank God those savages were saved from their natural habitat.
The humiliation and violence inflicted on black Americans was mirrored in Africa. At the end of the 19th century, as Europe's powers scrambled for control of the continent's riches, the rights of the indigenous peoples were no impediment to their plans for conquest.
The attitude of white people in all Europe was tabula rasa, terra incognita. Here is a place which is a sort of no man's land, and in other words, we can create our own states there, and we're going to bring order and civilize them. Always the word civilize was used, whatever you were actually doing, whether you were shooting them, you were civilizing them. The vast majority of people thought they would need, at best, a paternalistic treatment, that they would need looking after. like children.
After the Conference of Berlin in 1885, Europeans embarked on a continent-wide land grab. In less than 20 years, 90% of African territory would be placed under European colonial rule. One of the main beneficiaries was King Leopold II of Belgium. Aware of the vast fortune to be made, he persuaded Europe's powers to recognize his sovereignty over one of Africa's largest regions, the Congo.
Here was this man who became King of Belgium in 1865 at the age of 30. Enormously shrewd, enormously greedy, enormously ambitious, and with an absolutely brilliant sense of public relations. He hired the explorer, Henry Morton Stanley, the man who found Livingstone, to go to the Congo and essentially stake out this huge territory for him. Leopold got first the United States and then all the major nations of Western Europe to ratify his seizure of this enormous territory in the center of the continent.
First, Leopold created a smokescreen, claiming that he wished to educate a savage people.
They were all really fooled by Leopold because they took him at his word. They thought he was a sort of a man who's going to lose all his money in this crazy philanthropic venture. But they didn't realize what he was really after at all, which was to make himself hugely rich by exploiting brown hands and broad backs who were going to carry the wealth of Africa and load it on ships for his own personal profit.
Bring them! Extreme violence was employed to impose Leopold's dominion. The right hands of those who failed to meet rubber quotas were severed. Even young children were not spared. In 1896, a German newspaper reported that 1,308 hands had been gathered in one day. Leopold created a 90,000-strong army to enforce his rule. One of his lieutenants wrote, "Only the whip can civilize the black."
They would go into village after village. The army would seize the women of the village and hold them hostage in order to force the men of each village to go into the forest and gather a monthly quota of wild rubber. And they did this for about 20 years. And you can just very easily imagine if you have a village where the women are all being held hostage, the men are all in the forest as forced laborers for several weeks out of each month. There's nobody to plant and harvest food, to go hunting, to go fishing, to do all the normal things through which a community feeds itself. So from all of these causes, starvation, being worked to death, and most of all from the disease that hit this famine-ridden population, the best estimates are that between 1880, when King Leopold first got his hands on the Congo, and 1920, that in that 40-year period, the population was slashed from about 20 million at the beginning of that period to around 10 million at the end. So an enormous loss of human life.
Huge building projects throughout Belgium were funded by Leopold's wealth to celebrate his reign. Leopold built himself a palace, now called the Museum of Central Africa, to display his spoils. For historian Bambi Koipins, whose father is Congolese, the building embodies the myths created to justify Belgian rule in the Congo.
The central hall gives you the idea of what the museum is supposed to be about. You have the central dome through which the light falls on the heart of darkness underneath, you can say. Simultaneously, the dome also presents the sky, God, and then in the central hall, underneath that representation of Leopold II, are statues of Congolese. So what you really see were the hierarchical relationships that structured the relations between the colonized and the colonizers. As a human being, I'm obviously shocked by that, because it is very clear that Africans, the way that this museum was originally set up and the way that most of the exhibitions still work, are really dehumanized, because they were seen and represented as savages who really needed the help of outsiders, i.e. Europeans, to transform them into fully civilized human beings.
From the late 19th century onwards, human zoos exhibiting Africans in their primitive state became popular around Europe. One of the first was housed in the grounds of Leopold's museum.
The Africans were put on display so people could go and see them in very much the same way that they could look at, say, caged animals in a zoo, and their reactions were also very similar. There were notices saying that people were not allowed to throw peanuts at the Africans, because that was what they did. This museum is also, in a very real sense, the only monument to Belgian colonial history left in this country. So if we dismantle the museum, there is a very great danger that we also eradicate the public memory of that colonial heritage. And once that happens, of course, one paves the way for all these people who say, well, it was not as bad as that, was it? And Leopold II really did do a great deal of good.
In 1908, the year before Leopold died, his crimes were made public and he was forced to hand control of the Congo over to the Belgian government. But the cruelty continued.
The forced labor system did not come to an end because it was so profitable. The new Belgian Congo continued it more or less until the early 1920s. At that point, the Belgian colonial officials realized that their population was shrinking so rapidly from the effects of the forced labor system that they had to modify it. They had to make it less lethal, or otherwise they would have no labor force left.
Although 10 million people died, the Congolese genocide has largely been forgotten in Europe. In the book The Heart of Darkness, the author Joseph Conrad, who witnessed the violence in the Congo, writes, "The conquest of the earth, which mostly means taking it away from those who have a different complexion or slightly flatter noses than ourselves, is not a pretty thing when you look into it too much." It was only at the end of the Second World War, when newsreels documented the Nazis' extermination of 6 million Jews, that the words genocide, Holocaust, and even racism passed into common usage.
Whatever the origins of the word racism, that is when it was first coined, there's no doubt that it was first used to think about Nazi treatment of Jewish people. That was the case that gave the word racism its modern shape and meaning, in fact, brought it into use as a word, and also, therefore, brought it into use in a context where it was unequivocally clear that it was a very bad thing.
Even so, brutal treatment of non-white, non-Europeans was tolerated by the Western nations. When the National Party came to power in South Africa in 1948, they passed a series of laws that institutionalized white supremacy. Yet apartheid attracted little criticism from the West.
What white people wanted in this country was to protect their political supremacy, but in ways that nevertheless guaranteed them access to as much black labor as they wanted. One should remember that apartheid was never a racially exterminationist regime. The intention was never to get rid of black people. The intention was to deploy black people in ways that made good economic sense to white people, so that the advantages of apartheid to whites would be a combination of political supremacy and economic prosperity. So the purpose of racial classification was to provide a mechanism for segregating access to resources, segregating access to power. So your racial classification, once determined, affected where you lived. It determined where you worked and what sort of work you were entitled to do. It determined who you had sex with and who you could marry. It determined what schools your children went to and what universities they were entitled to go to. It determined what shops you were allowed to use, whether you were allowed to drink certain kinds of alcohol and whether you were entitled to go to cinemas. In other words, it was a categorization that affected your life across the board, and it became internalized in a very intimate way as the basis of how people thought of themselves.
Do you think that the South African government's racial policy is right?
I really do, because we cannot mix with the lower nations at the moment, unless they are cultivated and educated and so on.
Apartheid erected a vast edifice of racist legislation, making interracial relationships illegal and forcing individuals to be racially categorized. Amid rising international criticism of their policies, the architects of apartheid emulated the creators of Jim Crow and adopted the separate but equal rhetoric of segregation.
The South African government just changed its rhetoric, and it began saying not that blacks were inferior creatures, but rather that everybody could govern themselves in their own particular places and ways. So it set up these 10 so-called homelands, or Bantustans as they were once called, where close to a majority of the population of South Africa was crammed onto these desolate stretches of land that never amounted to more than a tiny percentage of the country's land area. And they were dressed up with prime ministers and cabinets and flags and so forth, but it was a sham. But they had to go through the sham because things in the world had changed, and if they had been doing this in the early 19th century, they wouldn't have bothered about any of the sham.
During the 1950s, the anti-apartheid movement gained momentum. In 1960, 300 people demonstrated against the pass laws in a town called Sharpeville in the Transvaal, using the tactics of non-violent passive resistance developed over the years.
In South Africa, you'd had a history of very peaceful, humble, polite petitioning of the authorities, deputations, and each deputation, came back empty-handed. And, well, if that doesn't work, let's try something else. So people then adopted non-violent forms of resistance. But that was just met with violence, culminating in Sharpeville. That was, in a sense, a turning point for everyone, that, people assemble outside a police station in a demonstration unarmed, and 69 of them, majority shot in the back, meaning that they were actually fleeing from the scene. Of course, that creates a great deal of anger. And I think for many people, that was it. And people said, well, if that's going to be the response, we've got to have to find other means of taking care of this situation.
There are many people who feel that it is useless and futile for us to continue talking peace and non-violence against a government whose reply is only savage attacks.
Following the Sharpeville massacre, the African National Congress was banned, and 2 years later, its leader, Nelson Mandela, was imprisoned. At his trial, he announced that the events of 1960 had compelled the ANC to commit itself to armed struggle. Violence, said Mandela, was inevitable in this country. The architects of apartheid turned his prophecy into a reality.
Increasingly, they began to kill people. I think it was just deliberate murder of people. It was not a mistake. There was hardly a family in the urban areas and townships and later in the rural areas that had not been affected by detentions, by torture. So it was just about every family in the townships was affected by it.
In 1976, South Africa's black school children protested against a new law stipulating that classes be taught in Afrikaans, a language most couldn't speak. 250,000 black people rioted in Soweto alone. Over 500 people were killed by the police during the Soweto uprising, including black consciousness leader Steve Biko. South Africa was engulfed in a firestorm of violence. Yet in the West, there were still many apologists for apartheid. But this isn't surprising. In the southern states of the USA, many features of apartheid, the disenfranchisement of black voters, laws against intermarriage and segregation, endured well after the Second World War. As in South Africa, racial violence remained commonplace. In 1946, African-American soldiers returning from the war were being lynched at a rate of 1 a week.
There are cases when black soldiers waiting at the train station, waiting their ride, were lynched because how dare they wear that uniform? They had died for the lyncher and his right to murder them. This was the paradox and indeed the vicious irony of the black participation in the Second World War and the fight for democracy on foreign shores, which drove them to fight even more vigorously back here at home.
Protests from prominent anti-racists, including Paul Robeson and Albert Einstein, prompted President Truman, himself a former member of the Ku Klux Klan, to appoint a committee that campaigned to end lynching. At last, government initiatives to counter racism began to trickle through. In 1955, the ruling in the Brown versus the Board of Education case found that the provision of separate but equal schools was unconstitutional, bringing segregation in the education system to an end. White supremacists mounted resistance to the move. At Little Rock, Arkansas, National Guardsmen protected black pupils who had to run a gauntlet of racist violence in order to attend school. By the mid-1950s, those who resisted racism were liable to suffer severe reprisals, as was shown by the experience of a 14-year-old from Mississippi, Emmett Till.
I'm Simeon Wright, the son of Mose Wright. I lived in Mississippi in 1955. Emmett Till and my cousin Wheeler came to visit us Wednesday. This is the fateful night that we went into Money, Mississippi. Went to this little town, little store, Bryant's Grocery. After we got outside, Mrs. Bryant came out behind us. And she was walking towards her car, and that's when Emmett whistled at her. And when he whistled, man, it scared us out of our wits because we knew that was a taboo, and we couldn't get to the car fast enough to get out of there. Then we got in the car, we came home. Emmett and I, we went to bed, and about, I would say 2 a.m. in the morning, I heard this noise in the house, and I woke up. I saw 2 white men standing at the foot of the bed. And they marched Emmett out to the truck. So they took Emmett, and 3 days later we found out they had killed him. He was thrown in the Tallahatchie River. My dad said it looked like they had hit him in the head with a hammer. He was shot behind the ear. It was just a horrible scene.
I believe that the whole United States is mourning with me. And if the death of my son can mean something to the other unfortunate people all over the world, then for him to have died a hero would mean more to me than for him just to have died.
Emmett's mother, she decided that she wanted the world to see what those men had done to her son. So they had a casket, the top was glass, and you could see the body. You could see his mutilated body during the funeral procession. And the whole world were able to see what the Jim Crow laws and the people of Mississippi, the white people of Mississippi, were doing to blacks.
I never will forget it. I was 5 years old when I saw that picture. I was just stunned by the ferocity of hate that had produced the violence on this young man's body. And for Negro Americans, it strengthened our resolve that Jim Crow had to go.
Emmett Till's death was a catalyst. Less than 4 months after the murder, on December the 5th, 1951, Rosa Parks was arrested when she refused to give up her seat on a bus to a white passenger in Montgomery, Alabama. When Martin Luther King called for the Montgomery bus boycott, 99% of the black population took part, action which led to a Supreme Court ruling in 1956, which desegregated the buses. The civil rights movement was born. Civil rights protests met with violence, as happened when black people tried to eat at segregated lunch counters. Throughout the 1960s, protesters were wounded, imprisoned, and killed. The movement's most articulate spokesmen were eventually silenced. Dr. King and Malcolm X were to be murdered.
With this faith, we will be able to work together, to pray together, to struggle together, to go to jail together, to stand up for freedom together, knowing that we will be free one day.
Freedom comes to us either by ballots or by bullets. That's the only way freedom is gotten.
Although the Civil Rights Acts of 1964 and 1968 prohibited discrimination, the majority of black people continue to live in substandard housing, go to poor schools, and experience a lifetime of poverty.
Well, you know, Martin Luther King Jr. saw the failure. He said it himself. He said, look, the first part of the movement, relatively speaking, was a piece of cake. Because it was easy for America. Civil rights bill, doesn't cost much. Give people the right to vote, doesn't cost much. But now what we're doing, the second part of the movement, the part about economic equality and social injustice, well, that's going to cost something. It's not about just letting us have access to the lunch counter. Martin Luther King Jr. said, what good is it to be able to go to a lunch counter but can't afford to buy a hamburger?
From 1964 to 67, there was fierce rioting in cities across the US, as African Americans found that the civil rights movement left them as poor as ever. And in post-war Britain, the issue of racism had also been moved onto the political agenda after race rioting at Notting Hill in 1958.
Something new and ugly raises its head in Britain: racial violence. An angry crowd of youths chases a Negro into a greengrocer's shop, while police reinforcements are called to check the riot.
You can get them all out of the country, and as soon as you can get them out, the better I'll be pleased, I'll tell you that.
By the mid-60s, immigrants from the Commonwealth and the colonies were arriving at a rate of 75,000 per year. This source of cut-price labour wasn't always welcome.
A Britain that had to face that while they had never thought twice about their right to be in a third of a globe, that when people from that third of a globe started turning up in Britain itself, in the heart of empire, that somehow they didn't belong.
Many black Britons welcomed the 1968 Race Relations Act, outlawing discrimination in employment and housing. But the Conservative shadow cabinet minister Enoch Powell attacked it in his infamous Rivers of Blood speech, making dire predictions about the consequences of immigration. He received over 40,000 letters of support.
The discrimination and the deprivation, the sense of alarm
and of resentment lie not with the immigrant population, but with those among whom they have come and are still coming.
Once that speech had been given, it produced a fundamental shift, I think, in the thinking of black people around their feelings of belonging to the United Kingdom, their feelings of being loyal colonial subjects and then being abused in this way.
The newly formed National Front took up Powell's banner. Its membership rose to more than 20,000 by 1974.
The rise of the National Front in the 70s, that was a terrifying time if you were young. You had to be, if you were young and black, you had to be very fit, able to fight, and run very fast indeed. I remember in our areas, in Oldham and places where I grew up, you literally had to jog through enemy territory. It was almost like some Hollywood movie, a gang movie. You were on your toes all the time, because if the skinheads came around the corner, you needed that half a yard advance on them to get away.
Madness. Madness.
By the time of the 1976 Notting Hill Carnival, many black people had lost faith in the police force.
The communities were already on a war footing with the police by 76. Because the generation that I was from was saying to our parents, well, you may have put up with it, but we were born here, and we are certainly not going to put up with it. We are broadly politicised by the civil rights movements in America and the struggle against apartheid in South Africa. And so we are keenly aware of what our rights are, and we will not suffer to be oppressed. The policing of 76 was swamp policing. So we're already in this age where the mass deployment of officers to reclaim the streets. There was a battle to claim the streets. It was the police saying, this is our territory, we're the biggest gang, we run it, you are going to do exactly as we tell you to do. And there was black people saying, you're racist, you're attacking our young people have the right to defend themselves, we will not put up with your behaviour anymore. All that came together into a heady mix of marijuana, music and madness in Notting Hill Carnival in 76.
This is madness. Man, I know I'm filled with gladness. It's gonna be rougher. It's gonna be tougher. And I won't be the one who's gonna suffer.
Very aggressive policing had been going on for very many years. You know, a group of young black men immediately being seen as threatening by the police as opposed to a group of young white men. People said no more.
For the next 5 years, relations between Black Britons and the police smouldered with resentment, until on the 10th of April 1981, the arrest of a young man under the so-called sus laws in Brixton, South London, sparked off a series of riots throughout Britain.
The fact that it was a shock to many people in British society just reinforces how many people just did not want to know what was happening around them, and that they turned a blind eye to intolerance, to injustice and to police brutality.
In 1981, 30 riots occurred across Britain, from London, Liverpool and Leeds to Handsworth, Halifax and High Wycombe. The official report into the riots by one of Britain's most senior judges, Lord Scarman, identified poor social conditions as the problem, rejecting the idea of institutionalised racism within the police. But in 1993, when the 18-year-old student Stephen Lawrence was murdered during an unprovoked attack by a white gang in South London, the subsequent investigation came to a very different conclusion.
Nobody came and spoke to us. No police officer ever came and said, well, this is what's happened to your son or anything. The police on the night, they did nothing. So they gave Stephen no first aid. They never checked anything. They didn't put him in a recovery position. He fell like that, and they just left him there. And until the ambulance arrived. So even if they could have done anything to help him, they did nothing. From the moment that Stephen was killed, people came to our house giving names and addresses of who they believed to be the killer of Stephen. Those information was passed straight away to the police. We kept nothing back. days that followed, they spent the time investigating us as a family, as far as they're concerned, that Stephen was black, so automatically he had to be in a gang, he had to have a criminal record, he had to have something. And that is not true, because you may have, I don't know how many percentage of families would be like that, but the large majority of black families are not like that. They're just like myself. So rather than investigate his murder, they investigated him.
For me, the central thing of the Stephen Lawrence tragedy was the failure of the legal system. And that history of failure is something that goes back before Stephen Lawrence was killed. It goes back to a period when black people became victims of crime and went to the police to speak of that victimage and to demand their help and protection in managing the risks and dangers involved. They were treated themselves as criminals.
While the police spent 2 weeks investigating the Lawrence family, his alleged killers disposed of vital evidence. Following the 1999 inquiry into the murder by Sir William Macpherson, institutional racism was identified as one of the reasons that Stephen's killers evaded justice.
The Macpherson report was an incredibly important document and still remains so in terms of getting white society in Britain to understand the fundamental dynamics of a phenomenon called institutionalised racism. And that is where you have no overt policy saying anyone is discriminated against, but that all the outcomes of your operations are overtly discriminatory. How do you get there? How does that happen? It's the culture of racism within an organisation that overpowers the formal commitment to equality that produces the racist outcomes. And we needed that phenomenon nailed, as that is exactly what happened during the case of Stephen Lawrence and many, many other black people throughout the country.
It's widely believed that Britain has become a less racist country, yet black Britons are overrepresented in the economic underclass.
In some senses, today I think we may be going backwards, and the reason why I say that is because the scale of racial inequality over the last 20 years, from 1986 to 2006, has increased. Infant mortality rate for black people has increased. Educational failure rate for black people has increased generally across the country. Unemployment rates for black people have hardly shifted in 30 years, still incredibly high. Imprisonment rates are still very high. 33% of all prisoners are from the Afro-Caribbean community and population that are jailed in London. So we're still seeing a huge discriminatory impact of race impacting upon black people's lives.
Though the former colonies are now independent, the global racial order remains intact. The distribution of wealth and power across the world hasn't changed since the days when ideas of racial hierarchy legitimized colonial conquests. White people in the Northern Hemisphere remain relatively rich and long-living, while the non-white peoples of Asia and Africa endure poverty and disease. Even in South Africa, the defeat of apartheid in 1994 hasn't resulted in the redistribution of wealth that was hoped. Today, the wealth gap between the average black person and the white rich is greater in real terms than it was in 1990, when the white supremacists ruled.
It's one of the deals that had to be cut. If you want to strip it of a lot of the verbiage, what it came down to was that, well, the whites would accept democracy provided that they weren't stripped of the property they'd acquired as a result of racial oppression. That's basically what the deal was.
If, when the African National Congress took over, they had said, okay, we want just not a political revolution, but an economic one. We're going to radically redistribute the wealth of this country, as we've been promising all these years, you know, to give the mines to those who work in them and the factories to those who work in them and so forth. I think they would not have been allowed to be part of the international economic system. And I think that probably the majority of the white population would have left the country. if their wealth had been taken away from them, their land had been taken away from them, as happened in Zimbabwe, for example. And economically, that would have been disastrous.
In the United States, the overt structures of racism have been dismantled without many black Americans escaping poverty. A recent study found that in 1968, a typical black family had around 60% of the income of an average white family. Today, it has only 58%. Black unemployment is more than twice that of whites, a gap wider than in 1972. Black infants are almost 2.5 times more likely to die in their first year of life, worse than in 1970. The belief that we live in a post-racist society has blinded us to the impact that skin color plays in determining our destinies.
Identically qualified black and white resumes, where the black ones are identified by the fact that the candidate has a name that is recognizably associated with African American identity, get different treatment when they arrive on the desks of employers. And this is not a hypothesis, this is an experiment that has been done in some cases with large amounts of data. And that's just still true. It's still true that being black disadvantages you in the employment market, just as, by the way, being a woman does, doing the same experiments. And that's despite the fact, probably, that the officials who manage this system don't think of themselves as racist and don't recognize what they're doing as practicing some kind of racial discrimination.
What drives the colorblind racism of the 21st century are three central institutional processes: mass unemployment, mass incarceration, and mass disenfranchisement. Mass unemployment, that is, for young black and Hispanic males between the ages of about 18 years to 35 years. In 1980, there were about 500,000 prisoners in the United States. Today, there are 2.3 million. About half of them are black in the United States. And so this process of mass incarceration in many states leads to the third pillar of colorblind racism, which is mass disenfranchisement. So in the state of Florida, in the year 2000, where George Bush wins the presidency by fewer than 600 votes, in that state, 818,000 Florida citizens who live in that state, they pay taxes to the United States, could not vote for the rest of their lives.
Disenfranchisement is not the only feature of Jim Crow to have resurfaced. In the mid-1990s, The Bell Curve became a bestseller by claiming that black people's poor performance in IQ tests proved their innate intellectual inferiority to white people. This was used to justify cutting back black people's benefits, but later criticisms were given little media attention. Its research relied on funding from the Pioneer Fund, a trust endowed by a Nazi sympathizer. Its authors acknowledged help from a professor who writes, "What is called for here is not genocide of incompetent cultures, but the phasing out of such peoples."
It was suggesting you can throw all the money you want and you can try to give them all the education you want, it will be a waste. A pig is a pig is a pig is a pig, and you can't put a pig in a chicken coop, because pigs are pigs, and chickens are chickens, and eagles are eagles. And so what it was trying to suggest is that all the social programming and social engineering that you're putting forth to help black people is all for naught, because they're inherently inferior.
Today, science is eroding the biological basis for the idea of race. The Human Genome Project has found that the average genetic difference between one African and another is the same or greater than that between a black person and a white person. The only genes that distinguish races are those determining skin color, and yet for many people, those genes, just 5 out of around 25,000, continue to shape destinies and determine fates.
The mythology of race exists for no other reason than to justify the attempt of one group to dominate another. And the useful fiction of race continues to allow people to conspire against the best in our human communities. So you can say to a guy, for instance, who's trying to hail a cab in New York City, "Excuse me, cab, I know you think I'm a black man and that race exists. I'm a fiction. I'm a figment of your imagination. I'm a social construct. There's no biological base or empirical verification for my melanin differential. I'm simply another human being possessing a different magnitude of melanin. I still ain't picking you up because you're trying to go to Harlem, brother. That's race."
Despite the long struggle against racism, it continues to pollute our mental environment. Its enduring potency ensures that people are denied opportunities, justice, and human rights. Key institutions stay racially monolithic, and racial privilege endures. For 5 centuries, racism has legitimized assassination, massacres, and genocides. The doctrine of white supremacy has demonized, brutalized, and dehumanized the non-white peoples of the earth. Racism has been the global driving force behind the dispossession of continents, the destruction of civilizations, and the extermination of entire peoples. The legacy of enslavement and empire has created deadly divides between the West and the rest. In scientific terms, racial differences have no material significance. Yet racism continues to shape the destinies of individuals and nations all over our world.